Hello. Hello, I'm Dr. E.W. Emanuel, the President of Medical Society of the District of Columbia. Welcome to Washington Healthcare on Wednesday, otherwise known as WOW. It's MSDC's weekly program devoted to informing and connecting the physician community in the greater metropolitan area. On this week's session of WOW, I am happy to bring you Dr. Van Susteren, who is an American psychiatrist, commenter, author, and an environmentalist with a special interest in the psychological effects of climate change. Dr. Van Susteren has founded several national organizations to raise public awareness of climate change and to advocate for environmental policies. Dr. Van Susteren, welcome, and please tell us a little of yourself.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate all that MSDC does for us. And I know that being president is a big responsibility, and I'm grateful that you're taking the time to interview me today. I'm also thanking Pia, who did quite a task it was to get us to find some time, but thanks to everybody. So I'll just be brief about me. I'm very excited to have this opportunity to talk about this book, which Emotional Inflammation, which was published last spring. And it was a labor of love. I will acknowledge that being in the space of looking at what's happening in our world today, there's no dearth of upsetting things going on. And this was pre-COVID. This book was written pre-COVID. It was written over the course of about 6 to 8 months with a co-writer, Stacy Colino, who's just a whiz-bang, just an excellent writer and writes very quickly. So I was really got the benefit of that. But I have found that in writing the book, what it did was it transformed so much of how I was experiencing so many of these traumas around me. There are political traumas, certainly. We have human rights violations, we have racism, we have gun violence. And my main catalyst has always been, and will probably always be, climate issues. But of course, since this book came out, we now have COVID. And it has had a huge obvious impact on us psychologically. So the book fits because it's all about traumas, and especially collective traumas. And of course, just over these last few days, the added insult of looking at Afghanistan fall and being so very aware very closely with what's happening to our brothers and sisters on the other side of the world. So you know a little bit about me because that's what I care about. You know that sometimes I'm in a dark place with these things, but that following some of the lessons of the book have been very, very helpful. And I hope, obviously, that it brings that same sort of response in those who are watching us today.
Thank you. I have, in doing my research, have been amazed by your past and many things that you've done. And before we can get to the book, I want to really just touch on one question of your accomplishments and all that you've done for the greater good and for society. What would you consider your greatest accomplishment and why, on a personal level?
Well, first of all, I'm laughing when you say all these things that I've done. I always think of my family telling me I have ADD, untreated. So there is some amusement that I get in hearing that. Since childhood, the only thing I really knew that I wanted out of life for sure, other than feeling a sense of purpose, was that I wanted to have a happy family. I wanted a family. And being a mom was something that was a sine qua non of everything. And I, obviously, as every mother knows, we have our good moments and our challenging moments. But my greatest accomplishment or my greatest joy is that I have 3 wonderful children and a husband and a very safe place to live. And then the added benefit of a profession that I'm very, very proud to be a member of.
Yes, I think many our audience, whether it's a mother or a father, can definitely agree with you that having a happy family, a family that promotes your feeling of worth, is a great accomplishment. It is. So I would
Well,
agree.
just to be a reality check, I'm not saying or suggesting that my family is always the happy family. This is not Leave It to Beaver here. I don't want people to have unrealistic expectations, but I am saying that we have a family that is very close. And it brings me great joy, and I know it brings them the same joy. I just don't ever want people to think, oh God, their family's happy, mine is fighting. So just wanted to underscore that.
Well, thank you for that. So I'd like to get into your concept of emotional inflammation. You have spoken about the feeling of anxiety that individuals may have due to impact. And the impact, as you said, may be from the corona pandemic. It can stem from gun violence. I know from a personal level, the impact of coronavirus and seeing what happened to George Floyd caused a level of anxiety in me. Can you just talk to our audience about that concept of emotional inflammation?
Sure. So we are all familiar with inflammation generally. Let's say it's a wrist that's inflamed. And what happens is that, yeah, I mean, usually we can use it, but it hurts. It doesn't function as well as when it's not inflamed. It's hot, it's overheated. We have to favor it. It impedes our spontaneity. So too, emotional inflammation is very much like that. It impedes our ability to respond to life with spontaneity. It can affect the joy that we feel because so much stuff hurts when we have emotional inflammation. So I call it emotional inflammation because it reminded me so much of what physical inflammation is like.
Okay, are there screening tools to recognize this inflammation, this emotional inflammation? I know we have our PHQ-9, our PHQ-2, GD87, but are there specific tools that you may recommend for the frontline physician?
Well,
and go ahead.
I would say that, and this might feel like a little bit of hyperbole, but I've been in this business for a long time. And I would say that if you're not emotionally inflamed, you're not listening. You've been living in a cave because these days we know there are so many challenges, superficial and profound, for ourselves personally and for the people we love. We want to provide opportunities for people to stay healthy or to get healthy. And we certainly know from all of what happened in the early part of the pandemic that those first responders were willing to put their lives on the line to save us or to take care of us. And you can't see something like that around you. You can't see, as you mentioned, George Floyd, see those images and think that's a brother. Why are we doing this to each other? And what promotes this? And how can we undo it? You can't see those images. You can't have these feelings without being emotionally inflamed. So when people say, is there some kind of a test? I usually say, if you're asking me, that means you got it. But what I do have that I really think is exceedingly helpful, and I actually even forget sometimes myself, is that what you can test for, and it's not something that you're going to take out, NIMH is going to write about, but it's a sort of a casual way of assessing how you cope with emotional inflammation. And this is what I see as key in how we deal with the challenges of the many traumatic experiences that are around us. So they're called reactor types. And they're basically coping styles.
Okay, How do we discover those triggers? Before we get to reclaiming, how do we recognize?
How do we recognize those coping styles?
How do we recognize the triggers to the emotional inflammation?
We just have to look inward a little bit. First of all, our political world, I'm not exaggerating and don't have to take a side, but we are deeply polarized. We see things very, very differently. The people that we want to get along with, that we want to work with, we can't always understand. And we know that it's critical that we work together in order to write policies and enact policies that are for the good of all. But what if you see things so dramatically different? What if your idea of the truth is so very different from one person to another? These are profoundly troubling experiences if you're serious. For example, if you're either in politics, running for office, or you watch politicians, or you suffer the consequences of policies. This is a profoundly upsetting experience. Then, of course, we know that in addition to that, the gun violence, which mercifully has, because of the pandemic, there have been a few incidents, but not nearly, I don't think, of the magnitude that was pre-COVID. But we were obviously seeing children being shot. And the idea that we would take our emotional discomfort and use it in a way that enables, that we're enabled really to buy guns, and not just a pistol, but assault weapons that are for wars, that we turn those instruments of war against each other within our own society. I mean, how profoundly unnerving. Racism, systemic racism, which I think one thing about COVID, if there's any silver lining, and it's a way for us to honor those who lost their lives and those who so bravely put theirs on the line, it's to say that I think that the experience of COVID enabled a lot of us to sit the hell down and watch some of what was going on around us. We could see those 9 minutes, I guess now, on George Floyd's neck. We could see the outpouring of despair and anger and frustration. And we could feel people who live in a way that has not expose them to systemic racism, could begin to see what it's like to feel vulnerable, what it's like to not feel comfortable going out. And these are the issues. I think there was a certain amount of psychological priming that COVID enabled us to capitalize on in understanding what systemic racism. And as for climate, I could go on forever and ever. And that is that we saw in the early parts of COVID, once again, that lots of lessons were being learned. The air cleared. You could see across the city. You could see mountains. You could breathe. The waters in the canals in Venice. I remember a wonderful photo of a couple of German guys who'd thrown themselves into the canal. I think the Venetian police eventually picked them up, but they were swimming around. And there was wildlife in the streets. So we saw that once we stop making dumb decisions and start listening, that we can make enormous corrections very quickly. So what I hope is that in honoring those who put themselves so much on the front line, on the firing line, that we honor them by looking at what we can do to keep what we've learned alive.
Thank you. I do remember, thank you for that, reading about staying home has improved the environment. And that, as you said, wildlife were reclaiming their previous environment, places they had been taken away from them. On that level, how do we as individuals during this time of high emotional inflammation reclaim our equilibrium? What are recommendations that you have?
Thank you. Okay, so here comes the fun part from talking about the problem. And this is what's so critical in messaging. And I've had a tug of war with people for a long time over climate messaging. And they'll say, no, talk about green grass and blue skies, just say the happy stuff. Because people don't want to be depressed, and they'll have focus groups that show they don't. Well, you know, what we self-report and what we actually do can be very, very different. Social psychologists say it is imperative to break through the noise and all of the competition for attention. You've got to talk about the problem in no uncertain terms, in a way that people feel as if it is immediate and it is dramatic. And action needs to be taken. That's step one. Step two, take all the emotions, the anxiety that you've driven up with the citing of all of these problems, and you redirect it into here's what you can do about it. Now, oftentimes, and certainly in climate messaging, I see this a lot, we'll talk about the problem like a hurricane, wildfires, and nobody says, but here's what you can do about it. Contact your public services, your utility providers, and ask them to make sure that the energy that's coming to your house is from renewable sources. Or ask your state representatives to put a little box on your bill. All you have to do is check it, that you want renewable energy. So the issue is that you take the problem and then you immediately segue to here's what we can do about it. And the magic is that when you feel anxious and there's a source to reduce your anxiety, that drives the movement towards a solution. So what we learned early on in COVID, you mentioned nature, the restorative, there's a vast, nature has a vast array of ways to restore us. I mean, we will say that we're products of nature. And I've found that indigenous philosophy is particularly captivating, because Native Americans, at least, make the point that it's not that we need to reconnect with nature. We're a part of nature. We came from nature, and we're designed to live in accordance with nature's rules. And here we are being so smart, the species, breaking a lot of the rules and expecting a different outcome. So my favorite sort of abuse, and I do it too, so I'm guilty. And every time I have to do one of these interviews, I think, okay, that's it. I'm actually for real, always going to do this. But it really is imperative. Our bodies were designed, for example, let's take circadian rhythms. When the light begins to fall, the photoreceptors in our brains, and we know we have a huge problem with insomnia these days, but the receptors, photoreceptors in our retina signal, there's a special highway, it's like the Dulles access road, special highway to the pineal gland where the master clock sits. And it tells the master clock what the light conditions are. Master clock, believe it or not, and this is from a Nobel Prize winning research from, I believe it was 2017, the researchers were awarded the Nobel Prize. That master clock sends out a huge flood of hormones and other substances to every cell, and that's like 60 trillion cells in our body, to say, okay, it's night, it's getting dark, start to shut down, do the stuff you do in the day, shut down the stuff you do during the day, and whatever you do at night, start amping that up. And that message is what allows our body to communicate with all the rest of the cells around them and with organs. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, it's getting dark, better turn the lights on. In your body, everything in nature, animals, plants, or almost all animals, when that light begins to go down, they say, okay, let's call it a day. And so what happens when we can't sleep? We all know what happens when we can't sleep. But the question is, we're saying, oh, I can't sleep. Why can't I sleep? And then we're looking for all sorts of medications or drugs, alcohol and other drugs to try to make us go to sleep. And of course, those have attendant problems. We know obesity is linked to lack of sleep. We know that of course, the consequences of drugs and substances have their own impacts on our health. I mean, I don't need to run through what those are, but that's just the sort of most primitive thing. So we're not going to turn the lights out at dark. But what we can do is, for God's sake, turn the devices off. They emit a blue light, which is very activating. If you get and I guarantee this, and I will also confess that I don't always do it, but after a presentation like this, I'm full of vows. You can get for $15 an amber colored light. I guarantee you turn that baby on and all the other lights off, and you get yourself a real live book. And I guarantee you're going to be falling asleep much more easily and stay asleep. So, and then there's the rest, which I'll just say one more thing, and that is this: we have a disproportionate impact on us analytically compared to what we were evolved to experience, which is the sensual aspect of life. What we see, what we smell, certainly the particles that we breathe in, and so what we hear. And the body was designed to respond to cues from nature that we're in a safe place. So if it's green, it suggests that there's water, there's biodiversity, and the fractals, the shapes of nature tell us that this is a place that is well designed in addition. So then if you hear water, for example, it tells you there's a tranquilizing effect of the sound of water. And everybody knows that. You do an EEG and you see all these alpha waves that are harmonious. So I can go on and on phytoncides. What you smell, Shinrin-yoku is a Japanese, it's called forest bathing. And Shinrin-yoku shows you how exposure to forest bathing, it improves your immune system, it improves your memory, it improves your mood. And the phytoncides themselves are disease fighters. So I urge you to go Shinrin-yoku or look at my book, but I've been way too long-winded, but it's just so exciting to see that this bounty is there for us for the taking if and when we get smarter.
Yeah, staying on that same aspect of discovering the triggers and reclaiming a balance. We know that physician burnout is real. We know that injury is occurring more and more, physician injury, and that they have put in place different programs, physician wellbeing. MSDC has done the same. But how do we as physicians, in an environment that is rapidly changing, where we are losing individual control of our practice, most of us are being employed, how do we discover the trigger of burnout? And in an environment where we're powerless, how do we reclaim that equilibrium as it pertains to easy access to the physician, emailing your physician, inundating with data, responding to CME requirements? What recommendation would you have to our colleagues who would be listening to these?
Well, thank you for asking that. I think you give me more credit than is warranted, but the problem is very real. And we used to be healers. And I think when we saw ourselves as healers, the joy that came from bringing people to greater insights and to the feeling of well-being was what offset that feeling sometimes of powerlessness and burnout. We did get that deep sense of purpose. And what happens often when you're employed like a bureaucrat by others, you don't feel empowered. And you've got a very short period of time to address what is a deeper problem sometimes in people, that their lives are out of sync with the way we were designed to live. So we are inclined to shove pills at them. And I see this particular, and I'm gonna just say it. I often have patients coming in, they'll have half a dozen medications that they're taking. And, they'll be taking supposedly something for ADD, which I referred to earlier, but then they got to take something to sleep because their stimulant keeps them up. And the real issue is that they feel deeply anxious and they feel alienated. Well, so do we at times. This isn't really, I think, what we had in mind was that we would be so tightly scripted by the people who own our time that we couldn't actually get to know our patients and connect with them. This is a tough job. And the feeling that we bring joy or a sense of possibility to them, and that they can take empowering actions, that they don't just have to take a pill that was sent to them, but they can lead healthier lives. But I mean, how much time do we have to train them, to encourage them? It's not the way medicine is set up right now. So you're right. But I think that the more we talk about ourselves as healers, the more likely it is to drive from the very top down, and that includes the way we're compensated. If we jump up and down about the fact that we didn't have time to talk about the healing aspects of what we eat, and that's another whole story, is the microbiome, the gut microbiome, which is the second brain and is in charge of everything. And, we give it, and I know there are food deserts and things like that where people can't get good food, but geez, there are lots of encouragement about community gardens. And there was a wonderful project here in DC. I'm just going to take the time to say this because I so love it. There were community gardens that a very enterprising fellow and his wife or girlfriend put together on the roofs of housing. And at first, everybody was saying, what are you doing this for? They were all against it. But little by little, what happened is people started to come to cultivate the garden. And it was not like they needed massive amounts of space. This was just space that was otherwise unused. So they started tending the gardens, getting to know each other. Fast forward, they started, of course, cultivating their vegetables, sharing them. Pretty soon we got a potluck going on. And all the people who didn't know each other now have a community. So this is what I mean about how important it is for us to go upstream, to see ourselves as healers that are connected and living in harmony with the way we were designed. We were designed to work with others. That brings us joy, and it is empowering. And we forget about our own narrow problems, or we're more likely to, when we are with a loving group. So, we should be telling insurance companies, not we should be, I hate saying we should be, but seeing ourselves as healers, I think is a key issue. And in all our manifestations in harmony with nature. I know that was long-winded, but I wanted to give it an example. Even in a food desert, if you've got, look what's happened in Detroit. Detroit has transformed with community gardens. Chicago, and all it takes is a few really key leaders, and those key leaders inspire the others to follow. Humans have a herd mentality. If we see other people doing stuff, we self-report that we're independent. It's not true. We do what we see other people doing.
I call it seeding. It's self-pollination. It takes one seed, like the mustard seed, to begin an entire movement. So I would agree. I'd like to transition a little to climate change and its impact on healthcare. Or is there a link? Is there a link in between climate changes, climate impact, and healthcare, or how one is impacted on a healthy level, whether it is emotional or a physical impact?
Okay, well, let's start at the top of the list, which is that epidemiologists will link COVID and pandemics generally to climate disruption. And the reason is that when you alter temperature, rainfall, humidity, and then you trigger the events that are associated, let's say heavy rains with mudslides or flooding. You have searing temperatures that make habitats unlivable, etc. What happens is that both the animals, in this case, infectious diseases from zoonotic illnesses, which is what COVID is, obviously, or vector-borne diseases, you change that habitat and you got animals on the move, you've got people on the move, you've got shortages that cause people to do things differently, that bring them into closer contact with vectors, with animals, with the contaminated water and food and all the rest. And so you have a recipe for pandemics, and this was long predicted. This is nothing that epidemiologists are surprised about. And it is critical for us to recognize, of course, pandemic like COVID, and the fact that that's one aspect of the other many impacts of climate disruption. And there's refugee crises. There's violence associated with elevated temperature and rainfall, and that's across all ethnicities and all areas of the world. And then there's disruption of communities. They don't work the way they did, so access to goods is imperiled. It doesn't stop. And then I will segue to, as bad as those storms are outside, it's the storms inside, the psychological storms, that are going to be the most catastrophic. You cannot have a healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And when people are afraid, and that's, by the way, that's not mine, that's Gary Cohen from Healthcare Without Harm. He should be credited with that. When people are fearful, angry at what's happening, and in despair, nothing works. Our political process shuts down, our economics shuts down, a society frays, we fray internally in families, etc. So anything that disrupts our environment, especially with the drama that we see with climate disruption, will have its fingers in absolutely every sector of our being. And you tell me if we can have a highly functioning, intricate society that's codependent when everybody's up in arms. And the other thing is that this is what is really upsetting to me. I used to be a profiler of world leaders at the Central Intelligence Agency. And one of the things that I learned, among many other things, was, and this is no news to psychiatrists, certainly mental health professionals, but when people are fearful, they regress. It doesn't bring out the best in us. And oftentimes, if that fear and that feeling of dependency isn't appropriately processed, it turns to anger. And we see that all over the world right now. And when we're angry, we don't make the best decisions. When we're fearful and angry, we get dumb because it shuts down the prefrontal cortex. Everything is, back brain stuff. The lights go out. And so we make decisions that are injudicious. We're not using our executive functioning. And we often look to elect people or to put people in power. We'll exchange our cherished values for the promise of security that some of the strong men of the world will make. And boy, that's not a pretty thought.
Yeah. Remaining on that concept of maintaining a sustainable health in a sustainable climate, what can we as physicians, those who have frontline practices or those in high administrative levels, do to change something that we know, in fact, needs changing, or we will not be here to, or our grandchildren to enjoy it?
Thank you very much for asking that. I am respectfully requesting, and I'll precede, respectfully requesting that any mental health professional who is listening to this or who knows a mental health professional, please send them our way. And by our way, I mean Climate Psychiatry Alliance. We need you. We want you. There's a place for you. You are critical. Even if you do graphic art, or if you like to show up at a protest, or you like to write something, we need you. We want you. So that's where mental health professionals can go. And then that is a specific area of activity that I engage in. And it has to do with making the case for reducing air pollution. We know that many psychological states, many serious mental illnesses are related to air pollution. The dementias, we know they're linked to bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety. We know the numbers in ERs go up, et cetera. So I will continue to make the case, whether it's air pollution, whether it's biophilic design, we should be pushing. And this is something that I encourage people to look at who are interested. We have something coming out that is called Eco-Psychopedia. It's not psycho, although sometimes I think that's a little bit more satisfying, but Eco-Psychopedia. And in it, you will see beginning to populate all sorts of information that tell you what you can do in terms of designing buildings that are green, that have the sound of water, where you see plants, where the air is properly ventilated and exchanged. Hospitals with cafeterias that don't send you next door to the cardiologists, but rather have you calm down because you've eaten food that's good for you. This is all role modeling, not so much glass and steel, but we know that wood and sunlight is what brings people's spirits up. So there are so many things that we can do. So what's also true is if you want to do it by yourself, that's great, do it by yourself. But we also know there's a magic to doing things with other people. It lifts us in a place that makes us feel as if we're a part of something bigger, which we are, and our collective voices are more powerful. Now, if you're not involved in the psychological aspects, although everything is psychological, and you'd rather join other groups, there are the Medical Society Consortium, of which the MSDC is a member, can give you extremely valuable insights about what you can do, where you can go, what you can say, and will call upon you if you want to be a spokesperson. So Climate Psychiatry Alliance and Medical Society Consortium, I think, are two of the best places for ease of involvement.
Thank you. Before we go, Dr. Van Susteren, are there any departing recommendations?
Yes, and that is that as somebody is turning what we know into what we do. And I know a lot of research, and research is legitimate, but given the peril of the hour, meaning that it is so late now in the game with climate issues, that our feet are literally being held to the fire. So in favor of taking action always, should be our priority. I have a friend who's been involved in this domain for a while. He's an expert on coral reefs, and he always says, doing more research. We like to do research, but that it's not research now. It's turning that research into action. We already know everything we need to know to take action. He says it's like arranging deck chairs on the Titanic to get a better view. We don't need a better view. What we need now is action. And we need people working together, because if we work together, there's nothing really that we can't change if we want to.
Great, thank you. I would say this has been enjoyable. There are concepts that you have written about that sparked, triggered my greater thinking. And I know that our physician community, as you said, we're leaders and we want to be involved. But there's also, we have been impacted by COVID, by other stressors. So I'm hoping that this conversation, this casual conversation with you, will help not just empower our physicians for our patients, but empower them for themselves. So I want to give a heartfelt thank you for joining us. I know you've been busy, and thank you for taking time to be with us. This was Dr. Van Susteren, who have joined us and have given some parting words. So thank you once again. And in closing, we hope that our audience have enjoyed this important topic and that they will refer back to our site at msdc.org for more information. We'll also like to post some of the sites that you quoted. So please stick around so that we can discuss more on that. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Pia?